The friction of the pen against the final contract sounded like a match striking dry tinder. That specific, abrasive scratch of ink sealing a billion-dollar fate. Around the mahogany table, lawyers exhaled, and board members reached for water glasses, their postures loosening with the relief of a deal finally closed. But I didn't feel relief. I felt a wire pull tight in the center of my chest. Across the expanse of glossy wood, Annie caught my gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just held my eyes with a dark, heavy intensity that had absolutely nothing to do with renewable energy. The project was finished. The excuse to be in the same room was gone, and the silence between us was suddenly screaming. Down in the main atrium, the celebration was a sensory assault. The industrial air handlers were fighting a losing battle against the humidity of 300 bodies, the cloying smell of expensive champagne, and the ozone tang of the new turbines spinning up in the adjacent hall. It was a symphony of success, a chaotic roar of congratulations that I had engineered but couldn't seem to inhabit. I stood near a structural pillar, holding a flute of sparkling wine I hadn't touched, watching the room swirl. They called us the Dream Team in the press releases, the chief engineer and the lead systems architect. But for 18 months, it hadn't felt like a dream. It felt like a Cold War fought with schematics and load calculations. Annie was chaos theory in a tailored blazer. She approached problems like a jazz musician, improvising, trusting her gut, bending safety margins until they screamed but never broke. I was the metronome, the rigid perfectionist who trusted nothing that hadn't been simulated 3 times. We had fought over every junction box, every inverter protocol. She called me a control freak. I called her reckless. We were both right. But the friction generated heat. I knew it. And terrifyingly, I suspected she knew it too. The noise in the atrium spiked as the CEO took the microphone. I couldn't do it. I set my glass on a passing tray and slipped toward the service corridor. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, severing the noise instantly. The silence of the plant's underbelly was different. It hummed with a low electromagnetic vibration that you felt in your teeth rather than heard. I walked the length of the gantry, my heels silent on the rubberized mats, heading for the control deck. It was the only place in this entire facility that made sense to me. Sterile, predictable, mine. I keyed in the code, and the glass doors slid open. The deck was dark, lit only by the standby LEDs of the main console and the moonlight filtering through the panoramic windows that overlooked the solar array. I leaned against the railing, finally exhaling the breath I felt like I'd been holding since the groundbreaking ceremony. Then came the sound. Click, 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 hard soles on metal grating. Deliberate, unhurried. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. My pulse calibrated to that rhythm instantly. You don't strike me as someone who runs from a victory lap. Annie's voice came from the shadows, low and textured, like rough velvet. I turned slowly. She was standing just inside the door, the light from the hallway backlighting her silhouette. She had ditched the celebratory champagne. In her hands were 2 heavy tumblers of amber liquid. No ice. She walked toward me, entering the blue glow of the control panels. She looked tired, but in that dangerous, magnetic way that made it impossible to look anywhere else. Her hair was loose now, falling over one shoulder, a subtle rebellion against the professional updo she'd worn in the boardroom. "I'm not running," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "I'm recalibrating. Is that what we're calling it?" She stopped a few feet away, extending one of the glasses toward me. "Drink. It's the good stuff. Stole it from the investor's private stash." I took the glass. Our fingers didn't touch, but the air between our hands felt charged, thick enough to have a texture. We stood there, the distance between us calculated to the millimeter. We were like high-voltage transmission lines running parallel out in the field, essential, powerful, and absolutely dangerous if they ever touched. If that insulation failed, it wouldn't just spark. It would burn the whole world down. And looking at Annie, watching her dark eyes track the movement of my throat, I realized the insulation was wearing dangerously thin. The view from the control deck was a study in absolute, terrifying geometry. Beyond the reinforced glass, the solar array sprawled out like a dark, crystallized ocean. Acres of photovoltaic panels tilted in perfect unison toward a moon that was currently hidden behind a bank of low, heavy clouds. It was a landscape of glass and steel, cold and precise, reflecting the sterile blue light of the control consoles behind us. In a way, it was a perfect mirror of the two of us. We had spent the last year and a half building this thing, forcing raw earth and chaotic weather patterns to submit to a grid of logic and efficiency. We had built a monument to control, and now we were standing inside it, two architects of order who didn't know how to function without a problem to solve. I took a sip of the whiskey. It was smooth, dangerous, sliding down my throat with a heat that settled low in my stomach, warring with the air-conditioned chill of the room. Annie was watching the field, but I was watching her reflection in the glass. She looked softer there, stripped of the high-definition sharpness of the boardroom lights. "To the grid," she murmured, lifting her glass slightly. I turned to face her, mirroring the gesture. To the grid. We tipped our glasses toward each other. The heavy crystal clinked, a sharp, clear note in the humming room. And then, as she pulled her hand back, her index finger brushed against my knuckle. It was the briefest of contacts, a grazing of skin that shouldn't have registered as anything more than a coordination error. But the sensation hit me with the force of a live wire snapping. It was a jolt of static and heat that traveled up my arm and settled at the base of my neck. It felt like a circuit closing, that instant, violent rush of current when a connection is finally made after months of isolation. I almost pulled away, my instinct for self-preservation kicking in, but I forced myself to hold my ground. I watched her eyes. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't pulled back. She was looking at her hand, then at me, her expression unreadable but intensely focused, as if she were analyzing the data from that single touch. We drank in silence. But this wasn't the silence of the conference room. That silence had been weaponized, a tactical pause while we reloaded our arguments about load-bearing tolerances or budget overruns. That silence had been hostile. This was different. It was the sound of the machinery running perfectly, leaving us with nothing to fix and everything to feel. A vacuum waiting to be filled, heavy with the things we hadn't said for 18 months. The grudging respect, the exhaustion, and the magnetic pull we had both pretended was just professional rivalry. Annie exhaled, a long, slow sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire project. She set her glass down on the metal railing with a definitive thud. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt strangely intimate, she reached for the buttons of her blazer. One by one, she undid them. Her eyes never left the horizon of the solar field, but I couldn't look away from her hands. They were capable hands, scarred slightly on the thumb. I knew from a site visit where she'd grabbed a jagged piece of conduit before the safety officer could stop her. She shrugged the jacket off her shoulders, letting it slide down her arms to rest on the railing. Underneath, she was wearing a silk camisole, something soft and dark that left her arms bare. It was a shedding of armor. The lead systems architect hung on the railing. The woman stood next to me. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the rigid posture of the corporate warrior dissolving into something human, something tired. I saw the vulnerability in the curve of her neck, the way she leaned her hip against the console, not bracing for a fight, but just resting. The air in the room seemed to shift. The sterile, recycled atmosphere of the control deck was suddenly invaded by sensory data I wasn't prepared for. I could smell the storm that was gathering outside, the sharp, metallic scent of rain hitting hot pavement, the ozone charge of lightning waiting to strike. But underneath that, cutting through the industrial sterility, was her scent. Cedar, something floral but dark like jasmine, and the faint, expensive trace of the whiskey. Beneath our feet, the floor vibrated with the low-frequency hum of the massive inverters in the basement, converting DC to AC, a constant, rhythmic thrumming that felt like a second heartbeat. It synced with the tension in the room, amplifying it, shaking the foundations of the walls I had built so carefully. We were alone in the nerve center of the machine we had built, and for the first time, I wasn't thinking about the voltage. I was thinking about the heat radiating from her skin, inches from mine. "The Phase 3 interconnect," Annie said suddenly, her voice slicing through the low hum of the room. I didn't model the thermal expansion. I just eyeballed the conduit run and prayed the heat wave wouldn't melt the casing. I turned to look at her, the glass halfway to my mouth, the amber liquid stilling. "You guessed? On a critical junction?" "I didn't guess. I intuited." She swirled her drink, the liquid catching the blue console lights. "But yeah, I spent the next 2 weeks waking up at 3 a.m. convinced I'd burned the facility down. I was waiting for you to catch it, to haul me in front of the board and expose me as a fraud who operates on vibes and caffeine." "I did catch it," I said softly. She froze, the glass touching her lip. "You did?" "I noticed the variance during the week 12 audit. I stayed late and reinforced the shielding myself." Annie stared at me, her guard dropping another inch, revealing the exhausted woman beneath the architect. "Why didn't you report me? You could have buried me. You could have had my contract." "Because the design was brilliant," I admitted, the words tasting like iron on my tongue. "It was elegant. Dangerous, but elegant. And I didn't report you because I was jealous you could see the solution without doing the math." "Jealous?" She let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dry leaves crunching. "I look at you and I see a machine. Perfect inputs, perfect outputs. I've spent 18 months terrified that one day you'd realize I'm just making it up as I go along." "It's not perfection," I said, my voice dropping to match the intimacy of the dark room. "It's fear. I don't check the logs 5 times because I'm diligent, Annie. I do it because I'm paralyzed. I'm terrified that if I miss one variable, one loose screw, the whole thing collapses. People call me unshakable. They don't know I'm just rigid because I'm afraid to move." The confession hung in the air, heavy and real. We were stripping away the titles. The chief engineer and the lead architect were dissolving, leaving behind 2 exhausted women standing in the dark. "We're pathetic," she murmured, but there was no bite in it anymore. 2 captains going down with the ship, except the ship isn't even sinking. We're just drowning on dry land. "It's the cost," I said. "The cost of being the ones who sign the papers." "It's lonely," she corrected. "That's the word. It's goddamn lonely." She turned fully toward me then, sliding her hand along the railing until it was resting inches from mine. The movement was fluid, predatory in a slow, careful way. She invaded my personal space, not with aggression, but with a gravitational pull that felt inevitable. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a physical warmth that mocked the air-conditioned chill of the room. The scent of her perfume, jasmine and something darker, like rain on asphalt, filled my lungs, drowning out the sterile smell of ozone. "I haven't had a conversation like this in 2 years, she whispered, her eyes searching mine, tracking the movement of my breathing. "I haven't told anyone the truth about anything. I just put on the blazer, walk into the meeting, and pretend I'm not waiting for the floor to open up." "I know," I breathed. And I did. I knew the weight of the mask. I knew the exhaustion of holding up the sky. She leaned in closer, her hip brushing against the console, trapping me between the machinery and her gaze. The rivalry, the sharp edges of our professional war, felt like they were disintegrating. It was like watching a stress test reach critical load. For the longest time, the material holds, projecting absolute strength, even as invisible microfractures web through the matrix. It doesn't bend, it just waits until the pressure becomes too much. I looked at the pulse beating visibly beneath the skin of her throat and realized we were both at that failure point. The concrete was finally yielding. "Why did you lock me out?" The question was quiet, but it landed with the weight of a dropped breaker. Annie didn't look at me as she asked it. She was staring down into the amber depths of her whiskey, swirling the liquid in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. I stiffened, my hand tightening around my own glass. I knew exactly what she was referring to. The grid instability last November. The substation cascade that had threatened to trip the entire regional interconnect. It had been the most terrifying 40 minutes of my career. "It was a containment protocol," I said, falling back on the technical jargon like a shield. "I had to isolate the control variables." "Bullshit," she whispered. She turned her head, fixing me with a gaze that dissected my defenses. I was standing right there. I had the load balancing solution in my head before the alarms even finished sounding. But when I reached for the terminal, you'd already changed the access codes. You locked me out of my own system, locked yourself inside with the crisis, and refused to let anyone in until the lights were green. "I handled it," I said defensively. "I know you handled it. You always handle it. That's not the point." She stepped closer, invading the small pocket of air between us. "The point is that you would rather risk a total system collapse alone than trust my hands on the controls for 10 seconds. Why?" The truth was a hard, jagged thing in my throat. I looked at the vast, dark array outside, the blinking red aviation lights on the far towers. It wasn't about competence, I confessed, my voice barely above the hum of the inverters. It was panic. If I'm not holding the wheel, I feel like I'm falling. I looked back at her, exposing the raw nerve of my own neurosis. "I locked you out because if you had fixed it, if you had saved the day while I stood there watching, I don't think I would have known who I was anymore." Annie watched me for a long moment, her expression softening from accusation to something far more dangerous. Understanding. She took a sip of her drink, the ice clinking softly. "You think that's why I fought you on the voltage regulation specs?" she asked softly. "You think I spent 6 months tearing apart your schematics in front of the board because I hated your design?" "You called my architecture derivative and soulless," I reminded her. "I called it safe," she corrected. A small, crooked smile touched her lips. "I attacked your plans because it was the only way to get you to look at me." The air in the room seemed to thin, leaving me lightheaded. "What? You were so perfect, so untouchable. You walked through this site like you were made of the same steel as the turbines. I wanted to prove that I was the only one who could find the flaw." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, stripping away the rivalry to reveal the twisted admiration underneath. "I wanted to be the only variable you couldn't predict. I wanted to be the chaotic element that forced you to recalibrate. Because if I could break your logic, even for a second, then I wasn't just another engineer to you. I was a peer. I was real." The realization washed over me, warm and dizzying. The arguments, the late-night email wars, it hadn't been hatred. It had been a frequency check. She had been pinging my sonar, waiting for a return signal that matched her intensity. And I had been terrified by the one signal strong enough to penetrate my firewall. We stood there in the semi-darkness, the silence no longer filled with professional tension, but with the terrifying intimacy of being known. She knew my fear of failure better than anyone. I knew her desperate need to be seen as brilliant rather than just lucky. We had memorized each other's patterns, studied the blueprints of each other's damage, and now, standing in the wreckage of our defenses, there was nothing left to hide. Suddenly, the overhead lights dimmed. The building management system, sensing the lack of motion, had cycled the room into night mode. The harsh fluorescent wash faded, replaced by the soft amber glow of the emergency mood lighting and the bioluminescent blue of the control panels. The shift in atmosphere was instant. The space shrank, becoming a private cockpit, a capsule suspended in the dark. The shadows deepened, carving out the hollow of her throat, the curve of her jaw. I heard the ice shift in her glass as it melted, a tiny, crystalline sound that felt impossibly loud. Annie didn't move away. In the dim light, her eyes were dark pools, reflecting the instrument panels. Her gaze traveled over my face, tracing the line of my cheekbone, and then, slowly, deliberately, dropped to my mouth. It lingered there for a heartbeat, long enough to register as a touch, long enough to make my breath hitch in my chest, before snapping back up to my eyes. The challenge in them was gone, replaced by a raw, open question that terrified me more than any grid failure ever could. Annie didn't retreat into the safety of a joke or pull back into the professional distance we had maintained for so long. Instead, she set her glass on the console next to mine. The sound of the heavy crystal hitting the composite surface was final, a distinct punctuation mark that ended the previous conversation and started something entirely new. She took a step closer, erasing the last calculated safety margin between us. Her hand came up, slow and deliberate, moving through the space that had been a demilitarized zone for 18 months. "You," she murmured, her voice rough and low, "have a hair out of place. It's ruining the symmetry." It was a deflection, a callback to my obsession with order. But her eyes weren't laughing. They were dark, dilated, and terrifyingly serious. Her fingers brushed against my temple, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The contact was shocking, not because it was aggressive, but because it was gentle. I froze. My entire system seized up. I was used to Annie throwing challenges at me, throwing data, throwing accusations of over-engineering. I was not used to her touching me. Her hand didn't retreat. It lingered. Her knuckles grazed the sensitive skin behind my ear, and her thumb rested tentatively against my jawline. My entire world narrowed down to that single square inch of contact. I found myself analyzing the sensation with the same frantic intensity I usually reserved for a cascading system failure. Her skin was warm, radiating a dry heat that seemed to seep through my pores. Her fingers were calloused, rough pads from years of handling wiring and crimping tools in the field, and that texture felt abrasive and real against my face. It was grounding. It was a tactile data point that my brain couldn't categorize. This wasn't the rival who tried to undercut my budget in Q3. This wasn't the reckless architect who ignored safety protocols. This was just Annie. Warm, solid, terrified, and terrifyingly close. The silence stretched, elastic and thin. The enemy label I had pasted over her face for the last year began to peel away, dissolving under the heat of her touch. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I didn't see the competition anymore. I saw the only other person in the world who understood the language I spoke. I saw the exhaustion in the lines around her eyes, the same exhaustion I felt in my bones. I saw the hunger that mirrored my own. The rivalry evaporated. It just ceased to exist, replaced by a raw, magnetic attraction that had probably been the engine driving our conflict all along. We hadn't been fighting because we hated each other. We had been fighting because the friction was the only way we allowed ourselves to touch. My pulse was hammering against her thumb. She had to feel it. It was a betrayal of my composure, a frantic Morse code tapping out, want, want, want. "I can hear the gears turning," Annie whispered, her eyes dropping to my mouth. You're running a risk assessment. It's a high-risk variable, I managed to say, my voice sounding wrecked. Stop, she commanded softly, her thumb tilting my head up. Stop calculating the blast radius. For once in your life, engineer, just be here. Just exist in the error. It was a direct challenge to my fundamental nature. I controlled things. I predicted things. But looking at her, feeling the heat radiating from her body, I realized I didn't want to correct this. I wanted to let it arc. I simply turned. It was a small movement, a pivot of my heel, but it changed the entire geometry of the room. The distance between us collapsed. We were inches apart now, occupying the same small pocket of air, and the buffer zone I had meticulously maintained for 18 months evaporated. The rhythm of her breathing hit me first. Shallow, erratic, matching mine. In the dark reflection of her eyes, I saw myself, the woman who checked the locks 3 times, finally standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing she wanted to jump. The air between us was no longer empty space. It was thick and conductive. I could smell the rain drumming against the glass, but closer, more immediate, was the scent of her skin, warm, clean, and terrifyingly real. It wasn't the sterile smell of the clean room. It was human. It was messy. It was the scent of the one variable I hadn't accounted for. Tell me to stop, I breathed. The words felt foreign, heavy on my tongue, vibrating in the small space between our lips. Tell me this is a bad idea. Tell me we're colleagues and this is a mistake and we should go back to fighting over conduit routing. Annie didn't speak. She just looked at me with those dark, devastating eyes and shook her head, a fraction of an inch. It was a denial of the logic I was trying to cling to. I don't want to fix this, I whispered, the admission tearing itself out of my chest. I don't want to correct the error, Annie. I don't want the night to end. I'm tired of being the one who holds the line. It was a surrender. A white flag raised not in defeat, but in invitation. Her hand, still resting on my jaw, tightened slightly. It wasn't possessive. It was anchoring. She slid her fingers into the hair at the nape of my neck, her thumb tracing the line of my pulse, which was hammering a frantic rhythm against her skin. Her other hand moved, hesitant at first, then decisive, coming to rest on the curve of my waist. The heat of her palm burned through the fabric of my shirt, a tactile brand that claimed the space. I leaned into it. The rigid posture I had maintained for my entire career, the straight spine, the squared shoulders, the armor of the chief engineer, just melted. I let the weight of my head rest in her hand. I let my guard drop, raw and immediate. It felt like the moment the turbines finally catch the wind. You spend months building the tower, laying the cables, testing the resistance. It's all theory and cold metal. But then the brake releases, the blades turn, and suddenly there's power. A rush of raw, kinetic energy flooding the lines, humming through the copper, waking everything up. It's a sense of rightness, a sense that the machine is finally doing what it was designed to do. After months of troubleshooting, of fighting the friction, the system was finally online. The hum in the room wasn't just the inverters anymore. It was us. We were the circuit closing. We were the flash of light in the dark. It didn't happen like an explosion. There was no cinematic crash of music, no sudden violent collision of bodies that you see in movies. It was slower than that, more deliberate, like the careful, terrifying calibration of a sensitive instrument. Annie didn't just take. She asked. She leaned in those final few millimeters, her eyes fluttering shut, giving me one last, breathless fraction of a second to retreat, to pull the emergency brake, to shove her away and retreat behind the safety of my title. But I didn't retreat. I held my ground, And then, with a trembling exhale that emptied my lungs of all the fear I'd been hoarding, I closed the gap. The first contact was a shock to the system. For 18 months, everything about Annie had been sharp angles and hard surfaces. Her critiques, her ambition, the steel-toed boots she wore on sight. I had expected her to kiss like she argued, with teeth and adrenaline. But she didn't. Her lips were impossibly warm and hesitant, a gentle pressure that wasn't demanding a surrender, but offering a truce. It was a stark, disorienting contrast to the cold glass and hard steel that surrounded us. I tasted the whiskey on her breath, rich and smoky, mixed with the faint, sweet taste of the mint she must have chewed hours ago. It was intoxicating, a sensory input that flooded my brain, overriding the logic centers that were still trying to scream warnings about workplace protocols. My hands, which had been clenched at my sides, unclenched instinctively. They moved without a conscious command, drifting up to find purchase. My fingers brushed the cool, slippery silk of her camisole, feeling the heat of her skin radiating furiously underneath, before sliding up to grip her bare shoulders. Her skin was smooth, fever-hot, and the contrast against my chilled fingertips sent a shiver racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Then the calibration ended, and the connection solidified. Annie made a low sound in her throat, a vibration I felt against my own lips, and the kiss deepened. The hesitation evaporated. Her hand at the back of my neck tightened, her fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer until there was no air left between us. The gentleness shifted into something urgent, something desperate. It was the release of 18 months of repressed energy, the breaking of the dam we had both pretended wasn't there. It wasn't just desire, it was relief. It was the frantic, starving realization that we had both been hungry for the exact same thing. I found myself pressing into her, my body seeking the solidity of hers. I was the woman who stood alone in windstorms to check turbine stabilizers, the woman who never leaned on anyone. But now, I was leaning. I was clinging to her shoulders like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. The friction of our bodies, the silk against my blouse, the warmth of her thighs brushing mine. It was a sensory overload that drowned out the hum of the plant. The kiss became a conversation, a rapid-fire exchange of data that was more honest than any report we had ever filed. It spoke of loneliness. It spoke of the terrifying pressure of perfection. It spoke of the need to be held by someone who knew exactly how heavy the weight really was. The silence of the control deck was no longer empty. It was filled with the sounds of us. The friction of fabric, the sharp intake of breath, the soft, wet sound of our lips moving together. It was a living silence, chaotic and human, disrupting the sterile perfection of the room. We were messing up the symmetry. We were introducing disorder into the system. And it was beautiful. In the middle of that kiss, with my heart hammering against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage, I felt something shift deep in the architecture of my world. I had built my life like I built this plant, efficient, fortified, solitary. I had designed it to function without dependencies. But as Annie's other hand slid up my spine, pressing me firmly against her, I realized that my design was flawed. I wasn't just kissing a rival. I was letting someone inside the perimeter. I was realizing that the empty space I had carefully preserved in the center of my life wasn't a safety feature. It was a void. And now, for the first time, I could see the blueprint for something else. I could see a version of the world where I didn't have to carry the load alone. I could see a place for her. We separated slowly, fighting the physics of it. It wasn't a clean break. It was a reluctant, heavy tearing of proximity, like two magnets being forced apart by an invisible hand. My forehead rested against hers for a long, trembling moment, our breathing ragged and loud in the quiet room. I kept my eyes closed, afraid that if I opened them, the spell would break, and the cold, hard edges of the control room would rush back in to replace the warmth of her skin. But eventually, gravity won. I stepped back. My heel caught on the edge of the rubber mat, a clumsy, human stumble that felt jarringly out of place in this temple of precision. The loss of contact was immediate and violent. The air conditioning, which I hadn't noticed for the last 10 minutes, suddenly felt freezing against my flushed skin. And with the cold came the logic. The chief engineer operating system, which had crashed the moment she touched me, began to reboot, and it woke up screaming warnings. My brain started running the audit. I looked at Annie, her lips swollen, her blouse slightly askew, her eyes dark and blown wide, and the panic hit me like a physical blow to the gut. What have I done? I turned away from her, gripping the cold steel of the railing until my knuckles turned white. My mind began frantically trying to categorize the last 10 minutes. I tried to label it as an anomaly, a data outlier caused by exhaustion and adrenaline. If I could label it a mistake, I could contain it, file it away in a corrupted sector, and go back to being the unshakable woman who ran this plant. I could fix the symmetry. I can hear you doing it. Annie's voice cut through the panic, soft but unyielding. I can hear you rewriting the history of the last 5 minutes. I shook my head, staring out at the rain-slicked solar panels without seeing them. We work together, Annie. The board, the protocols, we just signed the contract. We can't— Don't, she said. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. She didn't let me retreat into the safety of my spiraling thoughts. I felt her hand on my shoulder. Not a caress this time, but a grip, a grounding wire. She turned me around. I tried to keep my eyes on the floor, on the console, anywhere but her face, but she wouldn't allow it. She waited until I looked at her. Don't you dare call this a mistake, she whispered, her voice fierce and shaking slightly. You can call it ill-advised. You can call it terrifying. You can call it a logistical nightmare. But do not look me in the eye and tell me it was an error. I looked at her. Really looked at her. And the denial died in my throat. I couldn't lie to her. She knew my schematics too well. I don't know what to do with it, I admitted, my voice cracking. I don't have a protocol for this. I don't know how to operate without a defined outcome. That's the point, she said, her thumb brushing the pulse point at my wrist, calming the frantic rhythm there. We're off the map, engineer. We burned the map about 20 minutes ago. She reached past me and picked up her glass. The ice had melted completely, leaving a pale, watered-down amber liquid. She handed me mine. It was a peace offering, a reset button. We aren't rivals anymore, she stated, taking a sip and grimacing slightly at the diluted taste. That version of us is dead. We killed it. So, what are we? I asked, taking my glass. The condensation was cold against my fingers, a stark contrast to the lingering heat of her touch. I don't know, she said honestly. Partners? Co-conspirators? Two people who are tired of pretending they don't want to burn the building down? She leaned back against the console, her shoulder brushing mine. She didn't pull away. I didn't pull away. We don't have to draft the contract tonight. We just have to agree that the old one is void. I took a sip of the whiskey. It was weak, but it settled the tremors in my hands. I looked at the reflection of us in the dark glass. Two silhouettes standing close enough to merge. The rigidity was gone from my posture. The defensive walls I had spent 18 months reinforcing were rubble at our feet. And strangely, the sky didn't fall. The grid didn't collapse. The plant kept humming, indifferent to our crisis, steady and rhythmic. We stood there as the storm outside began to break, watching the clouds fracture and drift apart. We finished our drinks in a silence that felt fundamentally different from anything that had come before. It wasn't the hostile silence of the boardroom, and it wasn't the charged electric silence of the moments before the kiss. It was a quiet, companionable thing. It was the silence of the aftermath, safe and shared. We were standing in the wreckage of a structure I realized I never wanted to build, looking at a foundation for something new, something unplanned, and realizing it might actually hold. The dawn didn't break with fanfare. It arrived with a slow, methodical saturation of light that felt like a verdict. First, the deep indigo of the storm clouds faded into a bruised violet, and then, inexorably, the horizon ignited with a pale, blinding gold. We hadn't slept. We had spent the hours between the storm and the sunrise, sitting on the floor, backs against the console, trading stories that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the people hiding behind the titles. But as the light hit the glass, we stood up, drawn back to the railing by instinct. At 6:15 a.m., the automated tracking sequence initiated. It started as a low vibration in the floor, different from the constant hum of the inverters. It was a mechanical groan, the sound of metal waking up. Out in the field, 10,000 solar panels began to move. It was a synchronized dance of geometry, a vast, shimmering wave of glass tilting eastward to catch the first photons of the day. "Heliotropic," Annie murmured, her voice rough with fatigue but filled with a quiet reverence. "It's alive." I watched the array shift, the sheer scale of it breathtaking. For 18 months, I had looked at those panels and seen potential energy, revenue streams, and maintenance schedules. I had seen a machine that needed to be disciplined into efficiency. But standing there in the morning light, with the warmth of Annie's arm just inches from mine, I saw something else. I saw a system that knew exactly where its source of power was and wasn't afraid to turn its face toward it. "It's orienting," I corrected softly, watching the light catch the sharp angle of her cheekbone. "It's finding the connection." I wasn't talking about the panels anymore. I looked at Annie. The morning light was unforgiving. It showed the smudged liner under her eyes, the wrinkles in her silk camisole, the absolute fatigue etched into her posture. And she looked magnificent. The desperate need for every line to be straight felt distant now. I had built a billion-dollar facility that could power a city, but looking at her, watching the sunrise reflect in her dark eyes, I realized the most significant thing I had constructed was the bridge across the 3 feet of space between us. We left the control deck without fanfare. The walk down the service corridor felt different than the walk in. The silence wasn't heavy, it was companionable. The war was over. The treaties were signed. We walked side by side, our footsteps echoing in a rhythm that finally matched, leaving the sanctuary of the night behind us. In the elevator, the descent back to the ground floor felt like re-entry. The real world was waiting down there. The board members, the press, the emails, the inevitable complications of what we had just started. The gravity returned, pressing down on us. But as the numbers on the display ticked down, Annie reached out. She didn't look at me, but her pinky finger hooked around mine. It was a small anchor point, a promise of continuity in the chaos. "Breakfast," she said, as the doors slid open to the lobby. "I know a place that doesn't care about the dress code." "I'm buying," I said, squeezing her finger once before letting go. "Obviously," she smirked, stepping out. "You have the corporate card." I signed the final log entry at the security desk with a steady hand. System status, nominal. Output, optimal. But my mind wasn't on the gigawatts or the efficiency ratings. It was on the fact that for the first time in a decade, I wasn't going home to a silent apartment to analyze the day's errors. I was going to dinner. The contract was signed, the project was done, but the real work, the messy, beautiful work of letting someone in, was just beginning. If you've ever found clarity in the quiet moments with someone unexpected, subscribe to hear more stories about the connections that change us.